Hi, and welcome to another preservation workshop. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the care and preservation of photographic images. And if you don't know me, my name is Karen. I work in the Richardson-Sloane Special Collections Center at the Davenport Public Library, and we're happy you're joining us today. This is about the third in our series of preservation workshops, and I look forward to sharing a little bit about some of the processes we use here in the center and offering you some tips for ways you can keep your images safe at home. First of all, the credo is do no harm. And by that I mean don't undo things that have been done to an image already, and don't do anything further, because you can actually cause damage by some of the things that you do when you think you're being helpful. For instance, my mom labeled some images, which was very helpful, except for the fact that she wrote the name of the person right across their face. So that sort of negates the whole idea of appreciating the image. Don't remove any tape that's been put on it, because you might, when you remove the tape, you might remove some of the emulsion. A photograph is basically made up of two parts: the emulsion and the base that the emulsion is attached to. So some of these things that we think we're doing that are helpful are in fact not helpful. Don't put sticky notes on an image. That leaves a residue that can pick up very fine particles. Don't touch with your fingers. Always use clean hands. Wash, 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 and dry before you start working with your images. Don't put them in a magnetic album. They were really popular in the 70s. I don't see them so much anymore. But don't cut or trim unnecessarily. Don't remove from the original enclosure. I'll say that with a caveat that sometimes it is better to do so, but there are some steps that I want you to take before you do that. Another option to consider, which I'll show you some examples, is taking a high resolution digital scan of an image and carefully putting your original away and using that digital copy for most of your purposes. That's a really good idea. We recommend a high resolution of at least 600, and saving as a TIFF file, which is a very large file, but it's the best archival quality. A JPEG file, every time you make a copy, it loses a little bit of its compression. So that's not as good as a TIFF file. A TIFF file is very stable. Another reason to make a scan is if you have a scrapbook. Sometimes those old black pages, I know my mom did a lot of scrapbooking in the 40s, and the paper is very acidic, and so it's best to scan the whole scrapbook page at a time, and then, if you can, safely remove the images and then scan the individual images, which I went into detail on that in a preservation workshop I did on scrapbooks. So you might want to check that out. So arguably the most important preservation measure that you need to take for photographic prints and negatives is good storage, and by that I mean stable temperature, stable relative humidity. We want to realize that heat accelerates the deterioration process, and high humidity levels lead to fading, sometimes even mold or pest issues. And the combination of the two is really bad. So as a rule, try to keep your items in cooler, drier places, like a closet or an interior room, as opposed to like an outside wall. stay away from bathrooms, because obviously humidity from showers. Try to stay away from fireplaces, heat and soot and ash. Stay away from radiators, heating vents, kitchens. All those things can lead to deterioration, as well as light. That's something you want to consider. And that's why you'll usually see us here in Special Collections use paper enclosures, because that protects the images from light, whereas a Mylar or plastic enclosure does not. However, that might be the most appropriate type of enclosure to use if it's an item that's going to be handled a lot, perhaps at a family reunion or something like that. There again, a copy would be better, and tuck that original away. But if you feel strongly that you want that original item, then consider a clear Mylar enclosure. These simple precautions, really they are pretty simple, can reduce your damage and wear to your images, and the oils and dirt on your fingers can lead to deterioration. So you might want to consider cotton gloves. There's kind of two schools of thought with this, that gloves can be very helpful when using photographs, but I think that's true when you're working with cabinet cards or mounted images, but I think sometimes gloves are a detriment when you're trying to work with newer photographic prints like we have these days, because it's so much thinner and sometimes you can actually do damage. Also, your workspace. Have a nice clean workspace and dry. Lay down clean archival paper, something on your work surface, and if it gets dirty, switch it out, remove it, put some clean ones down. Every once in a while, go wash your hands. These are just simple things that you can do, but it really does pay off in the long run. Keep food and drink somewhere else. You don't want to accidentally spill your water. I get it that we all need to hydrate, but that's a bad thing to hydrate your photographic images. Don't use paper clips. I already mentioned don't use sticky notes. Don't use rubber bands would be another one. No self-adhesive tape. No glue. And again, I get the idea of the scrapbook and whatnot, but maybe for a historic image, you want to put a copy in a scrapbook. As far as labeling, we wish our ancestors had labeled their images more. We understand that sometimes they did it in ways that we would frown on now. We wish that they had used a pencil rather than a fountain pen or a ballpoint pen, but they did the best they could, and now that we know better, we're going to do better. So I want you to only use a pencil and only write on the edge, on the back. Please don't write in the middle of it. Please don't write all over it. And even better than a regular soft pencil would be an art pencil. That's what we buy here. This is a Faber-Castell brand art pencil, and they're a lot softer than a regular pencil. And I would really recommend, they're not terribly expensive, and if you save them and just use them for your photo work in the long run, I think you'll be happier. Moving on, I mentioned a little bit about enclosures, and I talked briefly about a clear enclosure. Like this would be something that would be appropriate for a postcard, and you can purchase these and just slide it in there. And this would work for a photograph too, obviously. It's an appropriate size. And then you can put the information on a label or even a piece of paper on the acetate or Mylar enclosure, and save your original so that you're not destroying that or you're not doing any harm to your original. Another option is to encapsulate, which is what I've done with this image. This is an orphan image, we call them when they're dropped off here and there's no information, no provenance. We don't know who donated it. It's just something that someone picked up and thought we might be interested in. So I use this as an example and I encapsulated it, which basically means you take two pieces of Mylar or inert plastic and you use two-sided tape to create an enclosure so that there's no tape on the image, it's around the image. And it's easily one that you could pass around. You can show it in displays. You can handle it. But if I ever wanted to take it out of this, I can undo it. This would be something that we would recommend as opposed to laminating. Sometimes people think laminating is a great idea, but you can't undo lamination. And so I did a workshop on encapsulation too. You might want to check that out sometime. I think now I'll go into some of our different sizes and types of enclosures that are available to purchase from reputable dealers like University Products, Gaylord, Archival Products, what's another one? Hollinger is another one that they have reputable archival quality enclosures. And when you're working with photographs, you want to look for the letters PAT, that stands for Photo Activity Test, I believe is the correct word. And so that means that they passed the test and they are archival quality. So with that, I'm going to pull out a few items from our collection and we'll get started. Okay, so to begin with, I wanted to show you a couple different types of envelopes that you can use. These are very nice. They come in a variety of sizes, anywhere from a small one like this for carte de visites to a mid-range one for cabinet cards, up to ones for 8.5 by 11. There are also what's called 4 flap enclosures. This one would be for a smaller image. This one obviously for an 8 by 10, something larger. And they just have 4 flaps with some pre-folded preformed creases on them. I'm not sure I can get that right in the light here. But this would be, you'd want to bend on both of those to make an edge to go up and around, so you actually end up, they're scored already, so I don't know if I can, that doesn't look very good, but they fit really nicely around lantern slides and around a thicker image that's been mounted on something relatively thick. So those 4 flap enclosures are really handy and nice. I use them quite often. Of course, there's always your good old flap, envelope flap, and those are nice. You can, any of these, then you write your information on the enclosure rather than on the photograph itself. And remember, if you do write on the photograph itself, you're always going to write on the back of it. This would be something that you could use for a more modern negative, like a 35mm negative. The negative strip would go in there, and you would just tuck the strip in there, like so. And then you can put a variety of strips in the envelope, like so. And then again, you can write on the enclosure what the items are in that particular set of strips. Those are very nice and certainly something to consider when you're working with a lot of negatives. Occasionally you have to make something yourself, especially if you're working with something like a cased image, a very old cased image. So in that respect, we make what's called a phase box. And you can go online and look at YouTube. There's any number of tutorials on how to make a phase box. But basically you cut out some shapes, you score some edges, and it takes some practice, but then it ends up making a little box, and then you can tie it up with some archival string. So that's something that you can consider doing, especially, as I said, for an older cased image. You're going to want to have something like that. Next, I'm going to show you some ways that we have organized some images. Well, first I'm going to show you how we oftentimes get an image. It just comes to us in the mail with a note that says, I bought this at a flea market. And here's an example of one that was sent to us. Whoops, she's upside down. This is a little bit unusual as far as the size goes. It came to us like this with no other enclosure, but you can see here it says Cozy Studio, and it gives an address in Davenport, but there's nothing else. So the best we can do is go through our city directories and look for the address that was on the image, 104.5 West 2nd. And as you can tell from the research I did, I found Cozy Studio at the Old North Putnam Building, 104.5 West 2nd. Room 7 and 8 was Mrs. Belle Norton, and that was in the 1910 directory. And then she was also listed by her name, Mrs. Belle Norton, at that address as a photographer residing in Moline. In 1911 there was no Cozy Studio, but there was a Cliff Hewins. 1912 there was no Cozy Studio, but there was an Otto Smith photographer. So the best guess here would be that this image was probably taken between 1910 and maybe 1915. You never know. And it's unusual in its measurements. I've got, I do have even to Russell Dodds in 1915. So so it could have been taken anywhere from 1910 to 1915. And that's really all we know about this image. We don't know anything else other than it came from a flea market and the donor mailed it to us. That's how we get a lot of our items. Pardon me. When we get a large collection, sometimes it's more beneficial to just simply put them in manila archival folders and separate each image with a piece of archival paper that we can write the description and the information that we find. So this is a bird's eye view. There's a sign on the building that says Wall Brothers, and the research that we did helped us figure out that between 1888 and 1889 at 332 West 2nd Street, Herman and Lewis Wall were grocers. And then this would be called a stereograph or a stereo card. There's two images put on the same card, and then you would place it in a special viewer, and when you looked through the viewer it would appear to be one image, but it would look as if it was in stereo, kind of, for audio. It would seem three-dimensional almost. And so that's a bird's eye view featuring the one business sign that we could find. And as you can see, somebody has made an X on a church steeple. And then there's another one, the same Wall Brothers. You can see that this time they've done it in a circle as opposed to the squares before. And so each one of these, and then we don't have to touch the image either. We can just pull it down with the paper and that helps to protect the images as well. So we like to do that that is a more economical way for us to deal with a lot of our collections. Another item that I wanted to share was how sometimes we have a variety of images, again, that are donated to us because it's a local photography studio, but we don't really know anything further about them. So in that case, we often will organize them by the photographer. And again, as I said, we'll just separate them with pieces, she's so cute, pieces of archival paper, and we write the photographer on there, and then if there's anything more that we know, we can add that. Or in the case of this collection, since there were so many, we actually created a typed finding aid with the name of the photographer, any details, if there's anything printed on the back, the address, if it's printed on the image. Those are all called cabinet cards, the ones that I was just showing you. A brief description of the baby, what they were wearing, and then a possible time frame. And this time frame typically will come first of all from the address of the photography studio, and secondly with the information that we gleaned from the image itself, like what was the person wearing, what was the hairstyle, what was the jewelry, what was the type of, if it's a gentleman, what was the type of necktie. Paper was rather poor and the condition of the images was really good, so we opted to remove the images from the album, keep them in their order, and put them in a file folder, being sure to put the page where the pictures came from up in the upper corner so that we could recreate the album if we ever wanted to. And as you can see, they're from all different time periods, variety of sizes. There was a small Tintype in there. Here's your 4 flap enclosure that we talked about earlier. There's a nice little Tintype. And as long as you're putting the labeling information on the papers, it's you're doing no harm. Here we wanted to leave the image in the enclosure, so I took another piece of archival paper, just cut it to size to give that a little extra protection from the acid that would be in the papers. So that's an example of how you can disassemble an album yet keep it in order, and then again the information is all recorded, the page number, if it was identified in the album, a guess as to the date, a description, size, whether it was a cabinet card, a Tintype, a print in a folder, if this photographer studio was known, and if so, what the address was at the time. So this makes it nice for when you're trying to find a certain family photo. And for our purposes here in the center, it allows researchers to quickly look through the names and see if it's anybody that they recognize. This is an example of an album where it's not in the best of condition, but it seemed better to leave the images in there if they were still in good shape. And so we put the interleaving archival paper, you can adjust that just a little bit, put the interleaving paper in there because you see the whole entire page has come apart from the binding. And then as you get towards the back, these Victorian albums, typically as you get towards the back, your images get smaller and smaller, where they'll end up with about 4 on a page. And then some of them had fallen out. Can you see that? Maybe adjust my camera a little bit. And so in that case, the ones that had fallen out already, we went ahead and, if they were found loose, that's what we wrote on the envelope, that it was a carte de visite or a CDV that was found loose in the album. And then again, I talked to you about having the option to use a clear Mylar as opposed to a paper enclosure. Here's an example where we opted to use the clear Mylar rather than paper. And last but not least, as far as our albums go, we have one from the 1900s, which the cover is in horrible condition, as you can see, but the pictures are glued to the pages, so we wouldn't want to harm this by trying to remove the pictures. So we're just leaving them as is. And the entire thing is just in its own safe little box. So sometimes we determine the value of the images if they're identified, if the places are places that we can tell are for sure local. Those are of higher importance, and we spend more time on those than something like this, where we don't know any of the people, we don't know any of the provenance, other than we recognize a few of the scenes as from local Davenport parks. Next is a very large, beautiful family Bible that came to us in really good condition, and it has family history information included in it, but it also had actual images included in it. So rather than, this is a bit unwieldy, it's very heavy, rather than leave the images in there, we removed them. We scanned them and processed them as others that I've shown you. We wrote the type. It's a Tintype. The photographer's unknown. It was identified in the Bible with these names and this date. And so we have all the information in there. Some of them are CDVs. Some of them are Tintypes. And then there were also a couple of large images that were in there. And then we actually scanned them, and to try to make things easier for this family, we used the scans to create a finding aid. And this is also an option that you might want to consider, particularly if you're trying to identify a large number of people. This is handy because you can look at the images on the computer side by side to try to look at facial features or similarities between family members, and compare maybe an unidentified picture with one that has been identified. Maybe find the same child at a variety of different ages. Maybe match up siblings in a certain time period, something like that. So that's yet another way that you can utilize your albums and keep your images safe. Just quickly, I wanted to talk about a couple different formats. We have talked a little bit about the negatives. If you have a lot of slides, they are safe in a metal container as long as it's, what's it called? Double coated, I believe is the right phrase. If you just have a few, you could do something like this, and this has a Mylar cover to protect the slide, and then this could be laid right on a light box. This also has holes if you wanted to put it in a 3-ring binder or a multiple ring binder. So that's one idea for how you can protect slides, and then again this just lives in a folder. Another that I wanted to show in this collection is a cased image, and it's an Daguerreotype, I believe. These are fragile. You can see that it's a case with a little hinge. I hope I'm getting that in the picture. And when you open, so these were probably taken 1855 to 1865. The images were, the emulsion was put on glass. It's very fragile. We don't have too many of these in the hinged cases, but this one, when you had to build a special box, I talked to you earlier about the special boxes sometimes that are required. And inside that cased image, we found this bit of identification with some names on it. So we put that in a Mylar polyester sleeve, and then placed that inside the paper envelope to keep it safe. And then the rest of this collection had a variety of tintypes, which I thought I'd just take a minute. Tintypes were printed right on the tin, and then that tin was cut. So you'll find tintypes of all different sizes. So this is a fairly large one. And again, I put them within a Mylar enclosure and then inside the paper envelope so that we didn't damage the tintype. Now here's an example of one that's framed, and you can see how they slip it in the back, slip it up into the frame. Here's one with a paper frame, another one. Similar, it's very similar to the previous one, so perhaps they were taken at the same studio. That one's the same paper frame. Here's another one that's been cut. It does not have a frame. You can see the tin. And another one with no frame. I thought I had one here that was in a different type of a frame. Oh, they're in this one. Oh, this is actually a Daguerreotype. This was probably taken even earlier, like in the 1840s to 50s. You see it's on polished silver. And this one doesn't happen to have a frame. The image almost floats if you could see it in person. It's like the image is floating. So that's an example of a Daguerreotype, excuse me. That dates probably 1840s to early 1860s. Here's a tintype with a different kind of a paper frame. It's a much thinner paper than the earlier ones that I showed you that were rather ornate. And as you can see, they just simply taped it on to the paper frame. Tintypes were pretty popular because they were a lot less expensive. They started prior to the Civil War, but they were really popular during the Civil War. Here's an example of a picture that they just cut it out. It's almost the size of a stamp. They just cut it out and mounted it on a piece of cardboard. And another tiny little print mounted, fairly thick paper. And here's yet another kind of a tintype. These are very much smaller. You can see the difference here in the size compared to the earlier ones. I love tintypes. It's pretty unusual to find a very, very large one. And we do have this example of a very large tintype. So let me put these aside. And this is in a 4-flap enclosure. And this is also a tintype. So you can see the image prints backward. It's just a loose piece, flexible piece of tin. This is quite unusual to have such a large one. Again, obviously you can't write on the back of a tintype, so all the information is written on your paper enclosure. And with that, I think that pretty much sums it up for today, and I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, you can always contact the Richardson-Sloane Special Collections Center at the Davenport Public Library.